For 3 centuries, it was the most powerful political organization on Earth. A quarter of the world's land, a quarter of the world's population, the largest navy ever assembled, the currency that financed global trade, an empire so vast that the sun, as they said, never set on it. Adolf Hitler threw everything he had at it. The Luftwaffe, the U-boats, the entire industrial capacity of occupied Europe. He failed to break it. What broke it was a cheque for $3,750,000,000 signed in Washington on July 15, 1946. Buried in the conditions attached to that cheque were clauses that would dismantle everything the empire had spent 3 centuries building, not over decades of gradual decline. Within 18 months, Britain signed it willingly, because a man nobody had heard of had spent 3 years ensuring it had no other option. His name was Harry Dexter White. He was an obscure American Treasury official, the son of Lithuanian immigrants, Harvard-trained, almost entirely unknown outside Washington. He never commanded a single soldier. He never fired a single shot. He attended a conference in a New Hampshire hotel in July 1944 and outmaneuvered the greatest economist in the world. And in doing so, he executed the most consequential financial operation in the history of the 20th century. In this video, we are going to show you exactly how it happened. The version written in loan agreements, conference transcripts, and conditions that Britain was never supposed to discuss publicly. The version that explains not just why the British Empire ended, but who designed that ending, when they decided to do it, and what specific financial instruments they used to execute it. Stay with us, because by the end of this video, the collapse of the British Empire will never look the same to you again. Before we follow the money, this channel traces the financial mechanisms behind the events you thought you understood. If that is the history you want, subscribe before we go further. The documents in this story have been sitting in archives for 80 years. To understand how the British Empire was dismantled, you first have to understand what was actually being dismantled, because the standard history of British imperial decline treats it as an inevitable moral and political evolution. The version that follows the money tells a different story. By 1939, the British Empire was the largest economic bloc in the history of the world. The Sterling area, the network of countries that pegged their currencies to the pound and held their reserves in London, covered approximately 40% of global trade. When a Malaysian rubber plantation sold its output, it was priced in sterling. When an Indian cotton mill settled its accounts, it settled in sterling. When a South African gold mine transferred its profits, they went to London banks. The City of London was not merely Britain's financial center, it was the financial center of the world. The pound sterling had been the world's reserve currency for over a century. Central banks in every major trading nation held sterling as their primary reserve asset. The Bank of England set interest rates that influenced borrowing costs from Buenos Aires to Bombay. This was not coincidence or reputation. It was structural. The empire's trade network was deliberately designed so that all financial flows passed through London, generating fees, commissions, and investment returns that funded the British economy. The imperial preference system, established formally at the Ottawa Conference of 1932, gave British goods preferential tariff treatment across the Empire and Commonwealth. A British manufacturer selling textiles to Australia paid lower tariffs than an American manufacturer selling the same goods. This system locked approximately 500 million people into a trade network that prioritized British commerce. It was the economic architecture that made the empire worth having. And it was precisely this architecture that the United States had been trying to dismantle since 1918. In 1938, approximately 40% of all global trade was invoiced in sterling. The London money market financed commerce between countries that had no direct connection to Britain at all. Brazilian coffee exported to Germany might be settled in sterling and insured at Lloyd's of London. Sterling's reserve currency status meant Britain could borrow cheaper than any competitor and finance its empire partly by issuing the currency the rest of the world was obliged to hold. This was the exorbitant privilege of sterling, and it was this privilege, not the colonies themselves, that American financial interests most wanted to capture. The colonies were a political problem. The sterling system was a financial prize. The war gave America the leverage it had been waiting for. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Britain went to war with an empire that appeared invincible and a treasury that was already under severe strain. The First World War had cost Britain approximately 1/4 of its national wealth. The interwar years had produced depression, unemployment, and mounting debt. By 1939, Britain's gold and dollar reserves were sufficient for perhaps 1 year of intensive warfare at most. The United States, under the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, could not supply weapons on credit to countries at war. Britain could buy American weapons, but only for cash, and only if it collected them in American ports using its own ships. This was the cash and carry system. And Britain paid. By the end of 1940, Britain had transferred approximately $4.5 billion in gold and assets to the United States. Gold was physically loaded onto British warships and shipped to America. American-owned assets in Britain were compulsorily purchased by the British government and transferred to Washington. The empire was liquidating itself to survive. By early 1941, the cash was gone. Britain could no longer pay. On March 11, 1941, President Roosevelt signed the Lend-Lease Act. American weapons, food, and industrial equipment would flow to Britain without immediate payment. It appeared to be an act of extraordinary generosity from a neutral power to an ally fighting for survival. It was not. Buried in the Master Lend-Lease Agreement, signed by Britain on February 23, 1942, was Article 7. The article required Britain, in exchange for the aid it was receiving, to cooperate with American efforts to eliminate what the agreement called discriminatory treatment in international commerce. The phrase was carefully chosen. Discriminatory treatment meant the imperial preference system, the tariff structure that had protected British commercial dominance across the empire for a decade. Article 7 required Britain to dismantle the economic architecture of its own empire as the price of survival. Churchill understood exactly what this meant. He fought to insert a qualification, the words "with due respect for their existing obligations," into the Atlantic Charter specifically to protect imperial preferences. Roosevelt assured him personally that the article was not aimed at eliminating the imperial system. Roosevelt's Treasury officials knew precisely what it was aimed at. The assurance was a diplomatic courtesy. The legal obligation in Article 7 was real. Britain had borrowed weapons from a country that used the loan terms to begin dismantling the empire's economic foundation. The weapons arrived. The obligation remained. John Maynard Keynes understood exactly what Article 7 meant. He had been advising the British Treasury since the start of the war and had watched the cash and carry system drain Britain's reserves with mounting alarm. Now he watched Churchill accept Article 7 and understood that the empire's economic architecture had been placed on the negotiating table as collateral. He wrote privately that the financial terms being extracted from Britain were more consequential than anything being decided on the battlefield. He was not wrong. He was also the man who would be sent, 3 years later, to negotiate what came next. The scale of what Article 7 was demanding is worth understanding precisely. The imperial preference system gave British goods tariff advantages across an economic bloc that covered 500 million people on 6 continents. A British steel manufacturer, a British textile producer, a British motor company, all enjoyed structural pricing advantages in Australian, Canadian, Indian, in South African markets that American competitors could not access on equal terms. This was not merely a trade policy. It was the financial rationale for maintaining an empire. The preferential access to imperial markets was what made the costs of empire, the garrisons, the administrators, the naval stations, economically viable. Eliminating imperial preference, as Article 7 required, would open those 500 million consumers to American goods on equal terms. American manufacturers had been watching those markets from the outside for decades. Article 7 was the door being opened, not by negotiation or gradual evolution, but as a condition attached to weapons that Britain needed to survive a war. It was fighting on America's behalf as much as its own. In July 1944, with the war not yet won, representatives of 44 nations gathered at a resort hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to design the post-war global financial order. The British delegation was led by John Maynard Keynes, the most celebrated economist in the world, the man whose theories had reshaped how governments understood economics, the intellectual giant of his generation. The American delegation was led by Harry Dexter White, an obscure Treasury Department official, the son of Lithuanian Jewish immigrants, Harvard-trained, almost entirely unknown outside Washington. He had spent 3 years preparing for this conference. He knew exactly what he wanted to achieve. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods already seriously ill. The heart disease that would kill him less than 2 years later was advancing rapidly. He came with a proposal for a new global currency he called the banker, a neutral international reserve unit that would give all nations equal standing in the post-war financial system, and that would prevent any single country from gaining the structural advantages that sterling had given Britain. For a century, White came with a simpler plan. The dollar would replace sterling as the world's reserve currency. All other currencies would be pegged to the dollar. The dollar alone would be convertible to gold. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, both to be headquartered in Washington, would manage the system. New York would replace London as the center of the global financial order. Keynes fought. He was brilliant, eloquent, and exhausted. He argued that White's plan would give the United States exactly the structural advantages that Britain was being asked to give up. the ability to run deficits, export inflation, and borrow cheaply from a world that had no alternative reserve currency to hold. He was completely correct. White outmaneuvered him at every turn. The Americans held most of the world's gold. Britain was bankrupt and dependent on American goodwill for its survival. The leverage was entirely on one side. By the end of the conference, White had won. The dollar was the world's reserve currency. Sterling was a secondary currency pegged to the dollar. The banker was dead. John Maynard Keynes, the man who had come to save Britain's financial position, signed the agreement that formalized its subordination. He died on April 21, 1946, 8 months after Bretton Woods. The empire he had tried to save outlasted him by a decade. What Ben Steele, in his definitive study of Bretton Woods, documented from the archival record was that this was not a negotiated compromise between allies. It was a deliberate geopolitical agenda hatched within Roosevelt's Treasury Department and aimed at eliminating Britain as an economic and political rival. White knew what he was doing. The conference, that the world was told was a cooperative effort to build a stable post-war order, was, in its financial architecture, the planned replacement of one empire's currency with another's. The consequences were structural and permanent. Before Bretton Woods, sterling and the dollar competed as international reserve currencies. After Bretton Woods, the dollar was the sole anchor of the global monetary system. Every other currency pegged to it, gold convertible only through it, the IMF and World Bank both headquartered in Washington and dominated by American voting power. The privilege this conferred on the United States was what Charles de Gaulle would later call the exorbitant privilege. The ability to borrow cheaply, run persistent deficits, and effectively tax the rest of the world by issuing the currency everyone else was required to hold. This privilege had belonged to Britain for a century. After July 1944, it belonged to America. It has never been returned. Keynes understood exactly what he had lost. In his final speech to the House of Lords before his death, defending the Anglo-American loan agreement he had negotiated while already gravely ill, he described the position Britain now occupied with a precision that bordered on anguish. He had gone to Washington to save the British financial position. He had saved Britain from immediate collapse, and in doing so had formalized its permanent subordination to American financial power. He died 8 months after Bretton Woods. The system he signed outlasted him by 27 years. On August 21, 1945, 6 days after Japan surrendered and the Second World War ended, the United States abruptly and without warning terminated the Lend-Lease program. Goods already in transit were stopped, contracts were canceled, ships were turned around. Britain, which had geared its entire economy toward war production, 55% of GDP in 1944, suddenly had no mechanism to pay for the food and raw materials it needed to survive peacetime. The termination was deliberate. Washington knew precisely what effect it would have. Britain's new Labour government, elected in a landslide while Churchill was still at Potsdam, faced the immediate prospect of economic collapse. It sent Keynes to Washington to negotiate emergency financial assistance. Keynes was by now visibly dying. The heart disease that had been advancing since before Bretton Woods had accelerated. He arrived in Washington in September 1945 in a state of physical exhaustion that his American counterparts could see clearly. He was the most brilliant man in the room and the weakest negotiator at the table, because Britain had nothing to offer and America knew it. What Britain needed was a grant. What it received was a loan, $3,750 million at 2% interest over 50 years. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006. Britain was still paying for the Second World War 61 years after it ended. But the money was not the most important part of what was agreed. Buried in the loan conditions was the requirement that Britain make sterling freely convertible into dollars within 1 year. This was the mechanism that would destroy the sterling area, and Keynes knew it. He warned the British government that the convertibility condition was dangerous, that the sterling balances accumulated across the empire during the war were enormous and would convert immediately if given the opportunity, and that the loan would be consumed in weeks rather than years if convertibility was attempted too soon. He was overruled. The loan was needed. The conditions were accepted. Keynes defended the agreement in the House of Lords in December 1945 in what would be one of his final public speeches. He described it as the only available option, not an ideal one. The peers who listened could see that the man defending it did not believe it would work. He died on April 21, 1946, 4 months before the convertibility condition came into force. He did not live to see what happened next. On July 15, 1947, exactly 1 year after the loan agreement came into force, Britain made sterling convertible into dollars. The conversion run began immediately. India, Egypt, Argentina, and a dozen other sterling area countries that had been watching the dollar's elevation at Bretton Woods moved their reserves without hesitation. Within 35 days, Britain had burned through more than $1 billion of its loan defending a condition it had been forced to accept by a country that knew the defense would fail. On August 20, 1947, 35 days after convertibility began, it was suspended. The experiment was over. The sterling area that had covered 40% of global trade, that had been the economic foundation of the British Empire for a century, had been fatally undermined in 5 weeks. The countries that held sterling now knew it could not be defended against dollar pressure. The financial architecture of the empire had been removed. What remained was the political structure, the military commitments, and the debts, without the financial engine that had made all of them sustainable. Keynes had been right. The convertibility condition had been a financial trap. Britain had walked into it because it had no alternative. And the man who had designed the trap, Harry Dexter White, had understood from the beginning that this was exactly what would happen. For 9 years, Britain maintained the illusion of great power status. It built nuclear weapons. It kept troops across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. It sat on the United Nations Security Council. It talked about the special relationship with America as if the relationship were between equals. On July 26, 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal Company. British Prime Minister Anthony Eden regarded the canal as essential to Britain's position as a world power. He decided to take it back by force, secretly coordinating with France and Israel to stage a military intervention that would be presented as peacekeeping. Eden made one catastrophic miscalculation. He assumed that the United States, led by his wartime ally Eisenhower, would either support the intervention or stay silent. Eisenhower did neither. He was furious, not because he sympathized with Nasser, but because he understood that public support for colonial military action would hand the Soviet Union a propaganda victory across the entire developing world. What followed was not a diplomatic protest or a public condemnation. It was a financial operation. The United States executed 3 financial strikes against Britain simultaneously. First, it blocked Britain's request for a $561 million standby credit from the International Monetary Fund. Washington controlled enough IMF votes to prevent the loan from being approved. Second, it blocked a $600 million credit from the U.S. Export-Import Bank. Third, Eisenhower personally threatened to sell the United States government's holdings of sterling bonds, a move that would have triggered a collapse in the pound's value and destroyed what remained of Britain's foreign exchange reserves. By November 1956, the Bank of England was losing dollar reserves at a rate that made devaluation or a complete float of sterling inevitable within weeks. Harold Macmillan, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, told the cabinet that the financial position was untenable. Washington's message was explicit: no financial support until Britain accepted a ceasefire. On November 7, 1956, Eden accepted the ceasefire. The military operation that had been within days of securing the canal was abandoned. British and French forces withdrew. Eden resigned in January 1957, citing ill health. Everyone understood the real reason. It was the first time in history that financial leverage alone had forced a major power to abandon a military operation. It was winning. Britain had not been defeated. It had been bankrupted into surrender by the country that held its debt. Harold Macmillan, who succeeded Eden as Prime Minister, drew the correct conclusion immediately. Britain would never again act militarily without American approval. The special relationship, which Eden had assumed meant partnership, was clarified at Suez as something closer to a client relationship. Britain was the client. What makes Suez the definitive endpoint of British imperial power is not the military withdrawal. It is the financial mechanism that forced it. Britain in November 1956 had troops in the field, military objectives being achieved, and the canal within reach. It was not losing the war. It was told that it could not afford to continue fighting it. The Bank of England was losing foreign exchange reserves at a rate of approximately $100 million per week. With convertibility now off the table after the 1947 crisis, a run on sterling would have meant devaluation, which Macmillan and the Governor of the Bank of England both concluded would trigger the complete dissolution of the sterling area and possibly the Commonwealth itself. 3 financial strikes by Washington had made continuing the operation economically impossible. Anthony Eden had believed, until the moment Eisenhower's message arrived, that the wartime alliance gave Britain a form of strategic independence. It did not. Britain's financial dependence on American goodwill, built through Lend-Lease, the Anglo-American loan, and the Bretton Woods system, meant that American disapproval could be converted directly into financial crisis at any moment Washington chose. Suez was the moment Washington chose to demonstrate that conversion. The lesson was delivered with complete clarity. It was never forgotten. Tally what the financial architecture produced. Article 7, the hidden clause in the 1942 Lend-Lease Agreement. The imperial preference system, 500 million people, 40% of global trade, traded for weapons to fight a war. Britain was fighting partly on America's behalf. Bretton Woods, July 1944. Harry Dexter White outmaneuvers the greatest economist in the world. The dollar replaces sterling as the world's reserve currency. The exorbitant privilege transfers from London to Washington. It has never been returned. The Anglo-American Loan, December 1945. A dying Keynes accepts the convertibility condition he knows is a trap because Britain has no alternative. The loan is consumed in 35 days. The sterling area never recovers. Britain pays the final installment in 2006. Suez, November 1956. 3 financial strikes, IMF blocked. Export, import bank blocked, sterling threatened. 1 ceasefire, 1 prime ministerial resignation. The moment Britain learns that the special relationship has terms and that it is not the senior partner, each step presented at the time as something else. Lend-Lease as generosity. Bretton Woods as cooperation. The loan as allied solidarity. Suez as a diplomatic disagreement. Seen individually, each had its own justification. Seen as a sequence, they form a single mechanism. A deliberate and documented financial dismantling of the British Empire by the United States, executed over 15 years, using loan conditions, currency architecture, and financial coercion as instruments. Hitler understood that Britain's empire was the obstacle to German dominance in Europe. He tried to end it with bombs and blockades and the entire military power of the Third Reich. He failed completely. Britain stood. The empire held. Harry Dexter White understood that Britain's empire was the obstacle to American economic dominance. He tried to end it with a currency peg, a loan condition, and an IMF veto. He succeeded completely. The empire that survived Hitler did not survive the conference room in New Hampshire. The documents are in the archives. The conditions are in the loan agreements. The intent is in White's Treasury papers. The result is in the date on the final check. December 29, 2006. Britain paid the last installment on the loan that ended its empire 61 years after the war that was supposed to have saved it. If this is the version of history that matters to you, the one written in loan agreements and conference transcripts instead of the one in the textbooks, subscribe, because every video on this channel follows the money the same way. The documents are usually there. We will keep reading them together.